There is a photograph taken in Venice in the summer of 2019. St. Mark's Square. Shoulder to shoulder, a sea of people so dense you cannot see the stone beneath them. Tour groups pressing against souvenir stands, cruise ship passengers dragging wheeled luggage over ancient bridges, selfie sticks raised like a forest of modern spears above the oldest city in the Western world. That image was called a crisis. Locals protested. Journalists wrote think pieces. The city was dying under the weight of tourism, they said. Now look at the same square in recent seasons. The pigeons outnumber the visitors on certain mornings. Boutique hotels that once had 18-month waiting lists are offering last-minute discounts online. Gondoliers, for the first time in living memory, are waiting for customers rather than turning them away. The most visited city in Europe for 5 consecutive decades is developing something it has never had before: silence. And the official story is that this is exactly what Venice needed. The tourists are gone, they say, and the city can finally breathe. But that is not what is actually happening. Because the tourists did not leave to give Venice space. They left because Venice gave them reasons to go. And what is replacing them, or rather what is not replacing them, tells a story that goes far beyond overcrowding and day trippers. This is the story of a city that spent 50 years monetizing its own mythology until the mythology started to crack. A city that sold the idea of itself so aggressively that people began to realize the idea was all that remained. If you have been watching cities like this carefully, you already know something is wrong. If you want to understand why the world's most iconic urban destinations are quietly losing the one thing they cannot buy back, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that mainstream media is too invested in the tourism narrative to cover honestly. Venice has been dying for a long time, longer than most people realize. The problem is that it has always looked magnificent while dying, which made it almost impossible to diagnose. You cannot see the rot beneath gold leaf. You cannot hear the structural failure beneath the sound of mandolins on water. Venice learned centuries ago how to make its decline look like elegance, and it never unlearned that skill, which is why what is happening right now is so significant. For the first time in the modern era, the elegance is no longer sufficient cover. The numbers are clinical and worth stating plainly. In 1951, the resident population of the historic center of Venice was around 174,000 people. By 2023, it had fallen below 50,000, with some estimates placing the true permanent figure even lower when second homes and ghost addresses are stripped out. The city is losing approximately 1,000 residents per year, not to death, to departure. Venetians are not dying out. They are choosing to leave their own city because the city has become functionally uninhabitable for ordinary human life. Rents benchmarked against tourist accommodation, supermarkets replaced by mask shops and glass trinket vendors, schools with shrinking enrollment, a hospital system calibrated for a population 3 times larger than the one that remains. The infrastructure of a city without the city. What makes this more than a demographic footnote is what it reveals about the tourist experience itself, because a city without residents is not a city. It is a stage set, and increasingly, the visitors arriving in Venice are beginning to sense, even if they cannot articulate it, that they are walking through a performance rather than a place, that the authenticity they came to find was exported along with the last generation of Venetians who could afford to stay. There is a particular kind of traveler who made Venice what it was commercially, not the cruise ship passenger on a 4-hour stopover the other one. The person who booked a week-long stay, who ate at the restaurant recommended by the owner of the pensione, who got lost in Cannaregio at dusk, and stumbled into a church that was not in any guidebook, and sat there for an hour in the kind of silence that only centuries of stone can hold. That traveler is disappearing from Venice, and the reason is not cost. Though cost is a factor, the reason is that Venice is no longer capable of delivering the experience it promises, because the experience it promises was always inseparable from the living city behind it. Remove the living city and you have architecture. Beautiful, extraordinary, irreplaceable architecture, yes. But architecture alone does not justify 4 hours on a budget airline and €200 a night for a room the size of a confessional. The cruise ship model accelerated this collapse faster than almost any other single factor in Venetian history, which is saying something for a city that has survived the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the Black Death, and Napoleon. At its peak, Venice was receiving an estimated 30 million tourists per year, most of them day visitors, most of those arriving by water. The cruise ships became the visual symbol of the problem because they were literally impossible to miss. Floating hotel towers moving through canals designed for merchant galleys, their wake destabilizing foundations that had survived 500 years of tidal pressure. When the Italian government finally moved to ban large cruise ships from the Venetian lagoon in 2021, it was framed as an environmental and heritage victory. What the announcement did not address was the economic hole that the departure of those ships would create, or who and what would fill it. The answer, as it turned out, was not enough, not nearly enough, the kinds of high-value, long-stay visitors who might theoretically compensate for the loss of mass tourism volume require something Venice has been systematically destroying for 30 years. They require a city, not a museum, not a theme park, a place where things happen, where people live, where the evening has somewhere to go after 9 lined, and the morning has a reason to move before 10. Venice has spent 3 decades optimizing itself for throughput, getting the maximum number of bodies through the maximum number of paid attractions in the minimum amount of time. That optimization is extraordinarily effective for one kind of tourism. It is lethal for every other kind. But here is where it gets more unsettling, because the decline of tourism in Venice is not simply a story about Venice. It is a story about a pattern, one that has appeared before in cities that looked nothing like Venice, but followed the same internal logic to the same destination. The pattern is this: a place becomes famous for what it is, monetizes what it is until what it is no longer exists, and then discovers that it has been selling a product it no longer manufactures. Rome saw early versions of this in certain neighborhoods. Lisbon is in the middle of it right now. Barcelona has been fighting it for a decade. Venice is simply the most advanced case study, the city where the process has run longest and gone furthest, which makes it the best lens through which to understand what is coming for the others. If patterns like fascinate you, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this kind of investigation deserves to stay visible. The history of Venice is the history of a civilization that built something extraordinary out of impossible conditions and then spent the next 3 centuries living off the mythology of having done so. The original Venetians were refugees, people fleeing the collapse of the Roman mainland, settling in the marshes of the Adriatic because there was nowhere else to go, learning to build on water because they had no land to build on. Out of that desperate ingenuity came one of the greatest commercial empires of the medieval world. Venice did not have resources, it had positioning. It sat at the crossroads of East and West, and it turned that geographical accident into a monopoly on the trade routes of the known world. Spices, silk, glass, salt. The Venetian state became extraordinarily wealthy not by producing things but by controlling the movement of things. It was in a very real sense the first modern financialized economy. That system worked brilliantly until it stopped working entirely. The opening of Atlantic trade routes in the late 15th century did to Venice what the interstate highway system did to Route 66 towns in the 20th century. It made the city's central advantage irrelevant overnight. Venice spent the next 2 centuries in a kind of prolonged aristocratic twilight, maintaining its forms and its ceremonies while its commercial power quietly drained away. By the time Napoleon dissolved the Republic in 1797, it had been effectively hollow for 100 years, sustained by the one industry that had replaced commerce, tourism, the Grand Tour, Northern European aristocrats coming to see the ruins of a civilization that was still technically alive but functionally historical. Venice had been in the tourism business, in other words, since before the word tourism existed, and it had been living off its own myth for even longer. What the 19th century grand tourists found in Venice was something that most modern visitors would recognize immediately, because the essential transaction has not changed. You pay to be in proximity to beauty you did not create. You consume the aesthetic surplus of a civilization's peak, the accumulated visual wealth of 5 centuries of Venetian painting, architecture, glasswork, and urban design without needing to engage with the civilization that produced it. Venice is magnificent because Venetians were magnificent. But the Venetians who were magnificent have been gone for a very long time, and the Venetians who remain are increasingly being priced out of the city that bears their name. This is the second layer of the pattern, the one that the tourist board does not publish in its annual reports. Tourism did not just fail to save Venice, tourism actively accelerated the conditions that are now driving visitors away. Every apartment converted from residential to short-term rental removed one more Venetian family from the historic center. Every restaurant that replaced its menu with a laminated English language picture guide oriented to cruise ship passengers with 90 minutes and no Italian drove away one more establishment that might have offered something worth coming back for. Every souvenir shop selling the same factory-produced Murano glass that is actually manufactured in China eroded the very craft tradition that gave Venetian glass its claim of premium price. The city ate its own foundations. The numbers that emerged from the post-pandemic recovery are instructive in ways the tourism industry found uncomfortable. When international travel reopened, Venice received visitors, significant numbers of visitors. But the average length of stay continued to decline. The average spend per visitor outside of accommodation continued to decline. The repeat visitor rate, the people who had been before and chose to return, dropped to levels not seen since the 1980s. And the category of visitor that every tourism board most desperately wants, the long-stay, high-spend, culturally engaged traveler who might reasonably be described as the last person on Earth who would visit a theme park, was choosing other destinations in numbers large enough to show up in the data. The testimony coming from operators inside the city is consistent, and when people speak honestly rather than for the record, remarkably candid. A former hospitality consultant who spent a decade working with mid-range hotels in the Dorsoduro district described the situation in terms that were difficult to argue with. The problem, she said, is that Venice has nothing to offer at the level of quality that justifies the price. You can charge Paris prices or Rome prices or New York prices, but those cities have restaurants, nightlife, culture that is still being made, not just displayed. Venice has museums and views. After 48 hours you have seen the museums and the views. There is nothing left. And for what it costs, 48 hours is not enough time to justify the expense. But the city cannot hold you for longer because it has deliberately removed every reason to stay. This observation cuts to something deeper than tourism economics. It cuts to the question of what a city actually is. And this is only the beginning of what the data reveals. The asset that once generated infinite revenue has begun to function as an extraction mechanism. For decades, the global travel economy treated destinations like finite mining concessions, operating on the assumption that an influx of consumption could never compromise the structural stability of the product itself. But an urban ecosystem is not a mineral deposit. It is a complex network of dependent variables where the removal of one piece destabilizes the integrity of the whole. When a city shifts its economic base entirely from production to display, it creates an internal imbalance that cannot be corrected by adjusting entry fees or marketing budgets. The infrastructure remains, but the operational logic changes, transforming a living space into a warehouse for short-term occupants. The data behind this transition is clinical, verified, and increasingly difficult to obscure behind seasonal press releases. By mid-2025, commercial registration records indicated that over 72% of available real estate units within the historic center of Venice had been adapted for non-residential use, primarily short-term rentals and holiday apartments. In neighborhoods like San Marco and Castello, the ratio surpasses 80%, leaving entire city blocks with zero permanent inhabitants. This is not a shift in housing preferences. It is a structural displacement. For a resident family, this means that a landlord non-renewal notice is no longer a localized inconvenience, but an eviction from the lagoon entirely, forcing them across the bridge to the industrial mainland of Mestre, where the economy is still tethered to real life. This housing imbalance has a direct, measurable impact on the survival of fundamental retail infrastructure. Between 2018 and 2026, the number of independent, non-tourist commercial licenses in the Old City, butchers, bakeries, hardware stores, and small repair shops, dropped by an estimated 42%. Concurrently, licenses for souvenir retail, low-tier food establishments, and synthetic luxury apparel expanded by nearly 60%. The physical transformation of the streets reflects this economic reality. When a multi-generational grocery store closes because its clientele has dwindled below a sustainable threshold, it is replaced within weeks by a vendor selling plastic carnival masks imported in bulk containers. For the remaining elderly residents in districts like Cannaregio, a simple task like buying fresh milk or finding a cobbler becomes a multi-kilometer transit challenge involving water buses and steep bridges. The institutional collapse follows the retail retreat with mathematical certainty. Primary and secondary school enrollment across the historic core has experienced a steady annual decline of 4.8% over the last decade, leading to the consolidation or permanent closure of multiple historic educational sites. In 2024, the neighborhood of San Polo saw its last remaining localized nursery school shut down due to a lack of eligible children within its catchment area. When a neighborhood loses its school, it loses the primary social anchor that binds young parents to a specific geography. The consequence is immediate. The remaining families migrate to regions with functioning civic infrastructure, leaving behind empty playgrounds that are promptly repurposed as outdoor seating for surrounding trattorias. This institutional withdrawal extends to critical services like healthcare, where facilities designed for a complex, multi-generational society are systematically scaled back. The local hospital networks, while architecturally grand, face persistent staffing shortages and budget reallocations as the permanent user base drops below critical thresholds. Emergency medical resources are increasingly calibrated around transient incidents, heat stroke, minor injuries, and acute issues suffered by short-term visitors, rather than long-term geriatric or pediatric care. For an aging population requiring specialized, consistent medical attention, the message from the system is loud and clear. They must either spend hours navigating the canals to mainland clinics or relocate permanently closer to the medical hubs of the Veneto region, abandoning the homes their families occupied for generations. The reality of this structural hollowing becomes clear when observing the daily routines of those who attempt to maintain a livelihood independent of the visitor industry. In a small workshop tucked away behind the Campo Santa Margherita, a master joiner named Marco works, surrounded by templates and hand tools that his grandfather used to repair traditional wooden boats and residential furniture. His order book is not empty because his skill has diminished, but because the objects he repairs are disappearing from the city. The private residential commissions that once sustained his business have dried up completely as properties are sold to corporate investment funds that prefer standardized, low-maintenance synthetic interiors for holiday rentals. On a typical Tuesday afternoon, the sound of his circular saw is the only industrial noise on a canal that once housed 4 separate artisan workshops. Marco spends his mornings not crafting wood, but reviewing warehouse lease options along the mainland railway lines. He notes without bitterness that when his lease expires next winter, the space will likely become an artisanal gelato franchise where the servers wear costumes but do not speak the local dialect. This domestic exit leaves behind an economic monoculture that is highly vulnerable to external shocks and, increasingly incapable of generating organic wealth. When an economy relies entirely on the extraction of visitor capital, it enters a phase of diminishing returns where every increase in volume reduces the value of the individual transaction. The high-spending, culturally motivated demographic does not simply avoid overcrowded spaces because of physical discomfort. They avoid them because an environment optimized for rapid throughput loses the authentic cultural production that justified the premium cost. What remains is an inventory liquidation of a city's aesthetic capital, where the assets are sold off piecemeal until nothing remains but the outer shell. This process of aesthetic liquidation is not unique to the Adriatic Lagoon, nor is it an accidental byproduct of local mismanagement. It is an established developmental trajectory that manifests with predictable regularity across global destinations that have allowed their real economy to be swallowed by their own reputation. The mechanisms are identical whether the backdrop is a canal, a Gothic quarter, or a historic square. A location achieves prominence for its specific urban character, monetizes that character through aggressive commercialization, and eventually replaces the actual community that created that character with a commercialized simulation. We see the exact same structural indicators appearing in historic districts across Southern Europe and North America, where the physical buildings are preserved with meticulous care, while the social fabric that gave them purpose is systematically unraveled. And this structural unraveling points toward an uncomfortable reality about the future of the world's most celebrated urban centers. The most visible transformations are often the most fiercely denied by those tasked with managing them. When an institution or a city relies entirely on a singular image for its financial survival, admitting to structural decay becomes a form of economic heresy. We are presented with official press releases celebrating record revenues, innovative tourist taxes, and high-tech crowd monitoring systems, while the physical reality on the ground tells an entirely contradictory story. The public narrative frames the current phase as an evolution towards sustainable luxury, a deliberate refinement of the visitor pool designed to protect the environment. But you cannot protect a city by removing the citizens. The administrative apparatus continues to publish metrics that measure success exclusively in hotel occupancy rates and airport arrivals, completely ignoring the internal metrics of civic collapse that are happening directly outside their office windows. This official optimism creates a profound, chilling effect within the community, where honest analysis is increasingly treated as a threat to the local economy. Independent researchers, urban planners, and local journalists speak privately of an unwritten rule. Do not question the sustainability of the tourism-dependent model if you wish to retain access to public data or municipal contracts. When local advocacy groups attempt to track the true number of non-resident housing units, they find themselves navigating a labyrinth of administrative foot-dragging and obfuscated registries. The official data is consistently spun to blend long-term residents with temporary workers and second homeowners who reside in the city for less than 3 weeks a year, keeping the official population figure artificially inflated above critical psychological thresholds. Those who work within the hospitality sector are equally hesitant to speak publicly about the drop in repeat visitors or the decline in per capita spending, fearing that any admission of diminishing quality will accelerate the exit of capital investment funds. What we are witnessing is the systematic replacement of authentic civic life with a highly managed corporate simulation of community. When a city becomes completely financialized around its own aesthetic value, it ceases to function as a home and begins to operate as an extractive financial instrument. This has consequences that extend far beyond municipal boundaries. If the most significant historical destinations are allowed to transform into unpopulated heritage preserves, it sets a dangerous precedent for urban planning globally. It proves that a city can be highly profitable while being completely dead. The regional economy becomes a fragile monolith, entirely dependent on external travel trends and highly vulnerable to energy crises, inflation, or shifting global tastes. The surrounding mainland regions are forced to absorb the displaced population, creating suburban sprawl and strain on infrastructure elsewhere, while the historic core becomes an empty monument maintained by a transient workforce that commutes from hours away every morning and leaves every night. This brings us to the core contradiction of the modern preservation movement, which has mastered the art of saving structures while failing to save the societies that gave them meaning. A cathedral without a congregation, a palace without a state, a residential alleyway without residents. These are not preserved histories, they are taxidermy. The light that falls across the ancient stones on a quiet winter morning still looks exactly as it did 3 centuries ago, but the silence is no longer the peaceful quiet of an enduring community. It is the eerie quiet of an empty room after the audience has left. The institutions have migrated, the children have gone, and the shops have been converted into distribution nodes for commodities that have no connection to local soil. We are left with an exquisite, irreplaceable artifact that has learned to charge admission, but has forgotten how to breed its own future. The trajectory is clear, and the question that remains is not whether this process can be hidden,